When a landlord lets a property for the very first time, the objective is usually straightforward: find a suitable tenant, agree the rent, and create stable income. And at the beginning, that often feels entirely achievable. However, what many landlords discover over time is that letting is definitely an ongoing operational responsibility. The real complexity rarely appears on day one. It tends to surface gradually, when certificates expire, when maintenance escalates, or when building costs arise. And that is the moment when property management stops feeling straightforward. In this video, I want to walk you through what really happens after a property is placed on the rental market. We will start with the letting process itself, how to identify the right tenant and what referencing checks truly matter. And then we move through compliance obligation, check-in and check-out procedures, maintenance, management, building level consideration, and finally the financial oversights that connects everything together. If you are preparing to let a property or you're already managing one, this video will help you understand what proper property management involves over time and where structure makes a meaningful difference. I am Marco Fasanella, I work in real estate as an advisor, operator and asset manager, with over 15 years of experience across the UK and Italian markets. I am co-founder of Habitat Investments and Habitat Living, and on this channel we focus on explaining how real estate actually works in practice, covering investments, development, acquisition and operation, always in a very practical way. Let's start from the beginning, the letting stage. Once a property is ready to be marketed, the first question is not simply how quickly it can be rented, but how it should be positioned and to whom. Who is the right tenant profile for this property? Is the rent aligned with the current market? Are you prioritizing speed or long-term stability? In practice, finding a tenant is selecting someone whose financial position makes the tenancy sustainable. One of the first legal requirements in England is the right to rent check, introduced under the Immigration Act 2014. In simple terms, landlords must verify that a tenant has the legal right to reside in the UK before granting a tenancy. This check involves checking original identification documents such as a passport or immigration status document and retaining evidence of those checks. If this step is overlooked, civil penalties can apply and, in some serious circumstances, criminal liability may also arise. Once the legal right to rent is confirmed, affordability becomes the next critical filter. A common benchmark in the UK market is that a tenant's gross annual income should be between 2.5 and 3 times the annual rent. So, for example, if the monthly rent is £2,000, you would typically expect an income between £60,000 and £72,000. But why is this ratio important? Because once tax and living costs are taken into account, a tenant whose income is only marginally above the rent can quickly come under financial pressure. And financial pressure is often the starting point for instability. In the past, we have seen situations where referencing was rushed simply to avoid a short void period, only for rent payments to become irregular within the first few months. So a short-term decision can easily create a long-term issue. If income falls slightly short, a guarantor may be appropriate, and the guarantor needs to be from the UK. However, that guarantor must also meet affordability criteria and be properly referenced. Otherwise, the protection offers little real value. For self-employed applicants, at least 2 years of accounts or tax returns demonstrating consistent earnings are generally expected. Again, also in this case, what matters most is stability and consistency. We must stress that strong screening does not eliminate risk entirely, nothing does, but it significantly reduces volatility. And that stability at the beginning often shapes the entire tenancy. Once the tenant is selected and the tenancy agreed, the focus naturally shifts to compliance, because everything else rests on it. At first, compliance can feel like a checklist: EPC, gas safety certificate, electrical installation condition report, smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms. However, compliance is not just a one-off exercise. For example, gas safety must be renewed annually under the Gas Safety Installation and Use Regulation 1998. Electrical inspections are required at least every 5 years under the Electrical Safety Standard in the Private Rental Sector Regulation 2020. Smoke alarm requirements fall under separate statutory regulations. And all of these are legal obligations, so they are not just recommendations. If, for example, a gas safety certificate expires, let's say, for example, only for a few weeks, nothing happens during that time, but had an incident occurred, the legal exposure would have been significant. And with multiple properties, renewal dates inevitably begin to overlap. So what initially felt manageable can gradually become fragmented. And this is why structured property management uses dedicated systems to track certification cycles automatically and send reminders before deadlines are reached. The objective is straightforward: protect your legal position. Because if something goes wrong, compliance documentation is among the first things requested. So with compliance in place, the next structural layer is documentation at check-in. The check-in process sets the baseline for the tenancy. A detailed inventory supported by photographs and clear condition notes creates a shared reference point from the very first day. At that time it may feel just routine, however its importance becomes very clear at checkout. Under the Housing Act 2004, deposit must be protected in a government-approved scheme such as DPS or TDS. If a dispute arises, deductions must be supported by proper evidence. So, if the starting condition was not clearly documented, the landlord's position weakens significantly. In practice, distinguishing between fair wear and tear and actual damage is straightforward, but only if the baseline was properly recorded. I've seen repair costs simply rejected because the original inventory at check-in lacked sufficient detail. So clear documentation protects both the landlord and the tenant. As the tenancy progresses, management becomes increasingly operational, and this is often where landlords feel the greatest pressure. In fact, maintenance requests very rarely arrive at convenient times. They can happen during the weekend or the night, in the evening, and while an issue may be minor from a technical standpoint, it rarely feels minor to the tenant experiencing it. The legal responsibility is clear. Under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, landlords are responsible for keeping the structure and installation in good repair. But beyond legal duty, there is also the human element. How quickly should you respond to tenants? How do you manage their expectations? What happens when a tenant becomes frustrated? In practice, prompt acknowledgement makes a significant difference. Even if a repair cannot be completed immediately, responding quickly demonstrates professionalism and reassures the tenant. I've seen in the past minor issues escalate into formal complaints simply because communication was delayed. The technical problem sometimes was very small, but the relationship issue became very large. Also, kindness and professionalism stabilize the tenancy relationship. When communication is delayed, frustration builds, and once trust is affected, even routine matters can become unnecessarily complicated. For this reason, clear procedures are also essential. Maintenance requests should be logged, contractors instructed promptly, and timelines communicated clearly to all parties. A small leak, for example, may not be structurally urgent, but without communication it becomes a trust issue, and trust, as we have seen, once lost, is difficult to rebuild. For flats within larger buildings, another dimension must be considered. Management extends beyond the individual units and into the building structure itself. Service charge budgets, communal fire compliance, roof maintenance, lift servicing, and major works programs all operate at building level. Under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, Section 20 consultation procedures apply to qualifying works, and these can involve significant cost contribution. Sometimes landlords are surprised by substantial roof replacement bills simply because service charge forecasts were not being reviewed carefully. So, are you aware of planned works in advance? Are you reviewing service charge accounts thoroughly? Unexpected cost exposure often arises from the building rather than the flat itself, but the building forms part of the asset and it requires active oversight. Finally, all these layers connect through financial clarity. And gross rent is only part of the story. In fact, once maintenance costs, service charge, insurance premiums, and periodic capital expenditures are all factored in, the net position becomes much clearer. So, are you analyzing the net income regularly or focusing primarily on headline rent? We have worked with landlords who believed that their property was performing very strongly, only to discover that once irregular capital expenditure was included, returns were materially lower than assumed. So without structured visibility over income and cost, performance can easily be misjudged. So clarity supports much better long-term decision, and when viewed in its entirety, letting property in London is entirely manageable, but it is not a passive job. It requires thoughtful tenant selection, proper checks, structured compliance management, precise documentation, responsive maintenance, building-level oversights, and ongoing financial control. Some landlords may choose to manage this responsibility independently, especially if they have the knowledge and the time to do so. Others prefer structured professional oversights to reduce exposure and ensure consistency. In the end, it depends on how much time, attention, and expertise you're willing to dedicate, not only to the day-to-day management, but also to staying up to date with continuously evolving regulations and best practice standards. If you find this kind of structured, practical discussion useful, this channel is dedicated to exactly that. Serious real estate content covering real estate investments, development, asset management, and market updates. No hype, no shortcuts, just how property actually works. If that resonates with you, I invite you to follow the channel, and I look forward to see you in the next video. Ciao!